you, Sarah. I
Hello.
see you on the screen. Hello, welcome to our symposium. It's a pleasure to have you here coming in from Copenhagen. For more than 7 years now, since 2013, you have been heading the National Collection of Photography at the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen, and you're coming in from Copenhagen today. Therewith, with this job, this business, you're the boss, not only of your team and your staff, but of more than 20,000 international and Danish artworks, starting from 1839 up to today. Also included in the national collection, good to know for today's audience, are 11 works by TORBEN ESKEROD, amongst them 5 of the Campo Verano project, which are also part of the FFF exhibition findings. Sarah, you will now tell us more about your photographic treasure and also about your work as a curator and as a writer on Danish photography. We are looking forward to your presentation.
So thank you, Sabine, and thank you, Selina, and the whole team for putting together this wonderful program and for inviting me. I'm really super excited to take part, and I'm very happy to be able to join from my teenage son's room in Copenhagen, which I've blinded out by a virtual background for your pleasure here. I could say, just to tie on to the conversation of yesterday between Alison, Selina, and TORBEN ESKEROD, that I really enjoyed. That one of the inspiring things they talked about in that conversation was that TORBEN also has a very interesting commercial practice, and this image that I'm using as my background today is actually a photograph he took for us in the Royal Danish Library of an exhibition that we made with the Danish artist Joachim Eskelsen. So we have several images by TORBEN in this story. So I wanted to begin with giving you a bit of background to the National Collection of Photography. It is part of the Royal Danish Library, that is the Danish National Library, and it was founded already in 1648. And photographs have actually entered the library collection since the media was invented. In the beginning, mainly as pasted in illustrations in books, of course. But in 1902, an independent department of images was established. And today the holdings of this department holds more than 18 million photographs on prints and film, and to a lesser extent also digital files. And they all come from purchase and donations. In 1996, a National Museum of Photography was founded as part of the library, and this was last year renamed into the National Collection of Photography. The basis of that collection was an already existing section of so-called photographic historical prints, which was established and begun collected in the early 20th century. This section was meant to include works of Danish and international masters, and it was collected due to their importance as unique examples of the history of photography. The National Collection of Photography holds around 30,000 works now that documents the history of photography from the daguerreotype and to Instagram today. 20,000 of these are digitized and will be online for the public to see later this year. The collection focuses on documentary and art photography, and it includes many of what you could call the usual suspects of a traditional history of photography, with an emphasis on Danish photography, of course, but also, as you can see from the list of names that I've added to the slide, a long number of names familiar from the North American and Western European canon. The highlights in our collections are what you would expect from a national collection of this kind. They are sort of solid or even classical names, and they reflect the historiography of photography that was prevalent during the period that this collection was built and structured. So it gives you an excellent overview of close to 200 years of Western photography. And to me, coming from a background in history, this is exactly, or especially fascinating, because it reveals sort of the long duration and the slow mental shifts in the culture of photography. If one wants to point out something obvious as a kind of bias in the collection, it would be that white male photographers and subjects form the overwhelming majority. But since the 1990s, especially, a lot has happened to the historiography of photography, and a critical revision of a kind has begun in order to include other subjects and actors and perspectives. And during the same time, artists in general also began to question history and historiography, and perhaps even more interestingly, the role of artists in history. And the contemporary works in our collection reflect this, like the most recent edition of work that I've included on this slide. It's an image by the Swedish photographer Arvida Byström, who's Instagram artist and photographer who works with female self-presentation and censorship today. So in the remaining part of this presentation, I'm just gonna introduce you to 3 Danish artists that have all been included in the collection during the past decade. And I have selected these 3, and it could have been many others, but I've selected these 3 particularly because they all shed light on overlooked history or overlooked areas of history. And while they do this, they also help us tease out the intricate layers of representation in our own collection. A cornerstone example is the work of Pierre Arche. Arche was the first artist in Denmark to deal with issues of colonialism. Herself the child of a Danish father and a Greenlandic mother, Arche was a pioneer of research, artistic research, dealing with post-colonial experience and memory. And I should perhaps mention to those who aren't familiar with the Danish Greenlandic history that Greenland has been a colony of Denmark until 1959. It was granted home rule in 1979, and since 2009 has had self-government status, but is still a part of the Danish realm. So back to Arche. She combined photography, found photographs, ethnographica, and text in a practice that she aptly named ethnoaesthetics. And she defined as, and I quote her, a description of the West seen from the outside, from the viewpoint of the other, from a point of view such of mine, that of a Greenlander, end quote. Arche took the history personally, and she worked with her own and her family's history, but she always made sure to tie it in with the larger complex geopolitics and history. She worked with self-biography by photographing places where she or her family used to live, and she often staged herself in the pictures with a sense of humor as well as seriousness. And you can see a typical example here where she has posed herself with a traditional Greenlandic boot, the kamik, as a tongue-in-cheek remark on the experience of being reduced to an ethnic stereotype in the gaze of others. In her work, Krabbe/Jensen, 2 historical photographs are juxtaposed with an image of Arche's own mother. The black and whites are taken by the Danish Dr. Thomas Neergaard Krabbe in 1906, while the yellow one of the mother was taken by Danish telegraphist Svend Lund Jensen in 1947. The contrast between the 3 photographs in Arche's montage is striking. The stern faces in the historical images appear uncomfortable, next to the ear-to-ear smile and self-conscious, perhaps even flirtatious, posing of the young woman in the middle. She stands firmly on top of a rock, one foot playfully turned inward in a funny or cute gesture, and she looks free and happy. By contrast, the historical subjects have their backs against the wall. and the exposure of their naked skin is not an everyday occurrence to them. This is revealed in the margins of the photographs. The dark suntanned skin on the young man's face and hands makes his torso stand out conspicuously pale, and the almost cropped out skirt of the woman that seems to cover her from the waist down is a European design, usually always worn with the top. So this nudity might fit in with the colonial list of the indigenous people being uncivilized or primitive. And it fits with the visual convention of ethnographic photography in the 19th century that was to picture non-Western people with naked upper body. The subjects were presented by Europeans or North Americans as objects of scientific study rather than fellow humans. So in this work by Pierre Arche, we are witnessing 3 meetings between a Greenlander and a Danish photographer. And the details in the photographs betray that the experience of being photographed has been very different for the 3 subjects.
Good morning.
So, copies of the historical photos appropriated by Arche are also found in our collection. They were added to it in 1936 as part of a large number of plates made by Krabbe for his book, which was called Greenland, Its Nature, Its Inhabitants, and Its History. When Krabbe traveled Greenland, the place was still a distant colony to the rest of the world. And this book was meant to present authoritative information on a landscape and its inhabitants, unknown to intended readers. Krabbe was an amateur photographer, but his images from Greenland can be appreciated and celebrated for their straightforward beauty and technical excellency. But they can, however, also be questioned as documents attesting to a specific colonial gaze in which subjects are rather brutally represented as stereotype. And Pierre Arche's work, I would argue, can help us to see them this way. Jeanette Ehlers is a Danish artist born from a Trinidadian father and a Danish mother. Her art revolves around questions of race, resistance, and representation, and around issues of post-colonial entanglements. Her practice includes photography, performance, and sculpture. And last year, we included her video installation work called Black is a Beautiful Word, I and I, in the collection. The work is an installation of a film looped next to a single framed historical photograph on the wall. You can see it to the left in my slide. This shows a woman of color sitting in an obviously staged portrait, and judging from her posture and facial expression, this woman does not seem to be at ease. The photograph is mirrored in the large video projection on the wall. This shows a succession of women of color sitting in a living room of her own time. The sound is a recital by the poet Leslie Ann Brown, and the text seems to address the subject of the historical photograph. A quote from it sounds, and I quote, "You are a possible me in the past, I am a possible you in the present, with a sea of time between us." This quote can be heard as echoing the activist slogan, "We are here because you were there," a slogan that's been employed by post-colonial migrants in Europe and US to point to the fact that they are here today due to former imperial campaigns carried out by European powers, such as the transatlantic slave trade, in which Denmark played no small part. The historical photograph used in Ehlers' installation work was taken by a Danish apothecary called Alfred Paludan-Müller. He lived in the former colony of the Danish West Indies from 1879 to 1904. And at this time, slavery had been abolished, but society in the colony was still permeated by racial inequality and exploitation. The image depicts Sarah, a black servant employed by Paludan-Müller, photographed on his front porch, where he also photographed himself, as you can see on the right, and others. These images were entered into our collection in 1985. They were purchased then from a rare books vendor. And according to our catalog record, they were purchased because they were a collection of nice amateur images from the former Danish colony. Elas's work, like Arche's, calls our attention to critical questions of gaze and consent. Who is looking at who? What kind of power was being played out in these situations of photography? By doing so, her work considers the representations of a colonial past that we find in our archive today. And at the same time, the work speaks to the experience shared by Danish people of color, feeling this legacy on their own body, so to speak. Trina Søndergaard is one of Denmark's most successfully visual artists with a photography-based practice today. She comes from a tradition of documentary photography that puts the photographer in the role of a field worker, but she has now moved towards a more conceptual practice. She often explores her topics through repetitive series of staged photography. The majority of her works are solemn portraits created in a studio setting. The models in her portraits are always, usually at least, unnamed, and they never make eye contact with the viewer. Vision and gaze seem to be a core theme to which Trina Søndergaard often returns. A signature motif in Søndergaard's work is a young woman carrying a historical headdress. In her series Guldnakke, it is a type of golden bonnet carried by farmers' wives to signal wealth in the 1800s. In the series Dress of Mourning, it was black costumes from various countries that should signify grief. And in Strude, it is the traditional headgear of the island of Fanø that would protect women against the harsh weather conditions of the region and at the same time reveal their marital status and other to the world. In these static portraits, the world quiets down so that we pay extra attention to detail. The headdress becomes signs for us to decipher. They hold significant information about women's work and life and roles in history. And while this work does not set forth a clear political statement, it does make visible what has often been overlooked. Later this year, we will open a retrospective exhibition of Søndergaard's works. The exhibition, which has been produced with Gothenburg Art Museum, presents a wide selection of works that has been created since 2000 until now. It makes apparent what the curator Johan Sjöström has beautifully coined as the circular visual poetics of Trina Søndergaard. Themes and phrases from previous projects echo within new ones. The portraits with historical headgear mirror the portraits of contemporary teenagers. And in all these reflections, general questions arise. What is the nature of portraiture and representation? And is it even possible to understand something or someone from a photograph of its surface only? As such, the work of Søndergaard invites us to think about art as well as history, and about the way we communicate, preserve, and appreciate both. Both Søndergaard's and Ehlers and Arche's works will be included in the exhibition The Camera and Us, which we hope, fingers crossed in these uncertain times, to open later this year. This is a permanent exhibition that will present a selection of works spanning our entire collection. And the exhibition takes its starting point in early portrait photography and develops from here in an investigation of different genres of photography, including fashion and family albums, as well as press photography and porn. The exhibition aims to ask what photography does to our conceptions of ourselves and that of each other. And the works of Søndergaard and Ehlers and Arche will create important perspectives from where to consider the assumptions of gender and race and representation found within our own collection. I hope we'll see you there. Thank you.